Now, we're going through the biggest transformations we've seen for hundreds of years. And Kissinger and others and Brzezinski talked about this a long time ago, because you see, nothing happens in the world on any large scale without planning. It takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of machinery to set it up. That's bureaucrats and various organizations to set a trend in motion. Lots of negotiations when they go through the United Nations and so on, and they bring in the desired kind of world which they plan. Because you see, there are rulers of this world, and they don't plan to lose control of the world as they bring us through these transitions. Even for the next 50, 100 years, they plan to have their offspring in control of it. And therefore, they often divulge a lot of information in their own books, because they've got tremendous egos. And they've got to tell you something. They want to be admired and worshipped by a peer group and all the lessers down there. But they let a lot of the bag, as I say, and they tell you what's often coming up. And a lot of it, too, is predictive programming, getting people used to the idea of inevitability, and that's how those who are not in the know see things. Oh, it's inevitable, I guess. What can you do? I guess it had to go this way. And that's what you're supposed to think. But we'll expose some of that tonight and show you how it's guided. Back with more after this break. Hi folks, we're back and we're cutting through the matrix, talking about the big changes we're going through right now. And really, even the changes I've seen in my own life, and there were radical changes, believe you me, from being a toddler growing up and being observant too, and wondering and asking questions as to why things were drastically changing. And I lived through the sexual revolution, as they called it, and a whole bunch of revolutions. And I knew darn well that they were not coming from people with a few placards on the street. They were coming from big, powerful, wealthy sources. And eventually I found out there were foundations, private foundations. And Professor Carl Quigley, who was the official historian for the Council on Foreign Relations, admitted that too. He called them the parallel government. The whole idea of democracy is an illusion. And it always was an illusion. There's always been an elite. They all agree on that. Every major writer out there agrees there's always been a dominant minority. And there always will be, according to Huxley, Aldous Huxley. And they don't plan to give up their power to the rabble down below, as you like to call them. But it's nice to have the people down below behave, thinking that they actually have a say in things. And we're supplied with all the circuses too, and the clowns we call politicians. They come out and speak on our behalf, supposedly, and go off in strange directions which they never ever mention at election times, to do with globalism and interdependency and giving your money off to other countries all the time as you go down the tubes, things like that. And I've watched this my whole life, but I've always tried to find out why, all the reasons behind it. And again, too, as I say, too, I've watched families fall apart. When I was young, people actually had children and kind of liked it. They didn't think of living any other way at that time. That was the norm. And really, I saw from the top, from the BBC, for instance, that was totally staffed by people from Eton. They only employed people from Eton to work in the BBC at that time. And I thought, well, this is the aristocracy. Why are they pushing all the pop music, they called it, and the go-go dancing, and the sexual liberation, the drug scene, they're pushing that mightily, and all of that stuff. And it's because, you see, it had been planned a long time before I was born, and we find traces of that in Karl Marx and all the socialist writers ever since. The destruction of the family unit had to come, and they would use what they called sexual liberation. Remember, all the wars that they used in socialism or communism, it's the same thing. Communism is just socialism in a hurry, and were used, and they called them revolutions. And that's why you got sexual revolutions or liberation as well. National liberation was part of the process, supposedly, of the Marxian theory. And lots of other liberations, but it's all to do with creating, as they destroy an old society, creating a new society and a new way of living for everyone. And of course they get right into the schools and indoctrinate the children there. And it still goes on today. It's even more hyper today, because the children, they have even more advanced techniques to get through into the minds of the children, and they'll all grow up being nice little greenies. And very few will ever think of mating. Most won't want children at all. And that's the way it's supposed to go, according to the Great Plan, you see. But part of this big foundation, this parallel government that is comprised of incredibly wealthy, tax-free foundations that all came out again in the Rees Commission in the 1950s. And there was a book put out too by one of the people involved called Foundations, Their Power and Influence, which is well worth the read. It was all verified by Quigley again for the Council on Foreign Relations, who talked about the parallel governments and the technocrats they would use as well. Technocrats, by the way, are the Kissinger, Brzezinski types, and the people who advise presidents, people who are appointed to the top, but they're never elected to anything. And they can be there one day, they could be at the United Nations the next year, and World Bank the following year, and then back into something else. They're rotated around, they get the big movements done to change the world, working in unison, all from the same central source, obviously, so they're all on board with the same agenda. And they don't get any criticism from the public, because the public are vastly unaware of them or what they're doing. And because they belong to private organizations, they are exempt from laws and prosecution and various things. They're not under governmental control, you might say. And that's the beauty of them. They can really get things done. And I've read articles here from the big books themselves, the big players, who have stated this, that they can get the job done. And the Club of Rome, that's another big powerful think tank working for these foundations, and as an advisor to the United Nations, one of the main advisors, talked about this too, that democracy was too cumbersome, too many conflicting parties. They couldn't get the job done. What they meant by that, by the way, is that they couldn't get their agenda rushed through. So they simply bypass governments altogether. That's agreed upon now, because governments haven't run themselves for an awful, awful long time. They bring in sources to run them. One of the links I'll put up tonight is from one of the sources. I've talked about the Rand Corporation many times and how it's called a charitable non-profit organization. It rakes in billions every year for doing these studies for governments and running all the facts back to governments, or statistics, I should say. And governments then act upon statistics run through computers and surveys. In fact, the whole Obama, it's not even Obama's medical scheme. They were on the go before Obama, getting it all ready. And for the U.S. Is based on a Rand report, the study. And the Rand mentioned in the report, they use Britain as the example that they would copy. Well, Britain is a basket case now in socialized medicine, and they're cutting them again, their staff all over the place. And there's more articles in the paper today. But Rand isn't the only corporation doing this. There's a bunch of them. I'm sure they all work together, mind you, because you couldn't have one going off in some other direction and advising another government to go off in some tangent which was not under control. So they all work together. But one of them is also called the Copernican Group, after Copernicus. And it's very interesting, because if you've seen the movie Wag the Dog, excellent movie to watch, because it shows you in a comical way things that really do happen, and how everything is perception to the public, and how they put displays on using Hollywood and everything to con the public into wars, for instance, the necessity for wars and various other things. It's used for everything actually today. But in that movie, you'll see some of the techniques they use and some of the lingo they use as well. Well, you'll find the same thing in the big groups like Rand Corporation and the Copernicus Group, because it's all the same language they're using. And it's a far bigger organization than just what the movie showed in Wag the Dog with the 2 or 3 people dreaming up the ideas. It's far bigger than that. And look at the change. They keep mentioning change. Their whole goal is change, because we're going through an incredible transition, as I say, where people used to think that saying things, although it was a con, they're actually overriding that now and telling you, well, no, you don't have a saying things anymore. And this is how it's going to be. And we've all been getting trained this way for quite a few years now. Actually, definitely since 9/11 happened in 2001. It's all authority, authoritarianism. And that's what the Club of Rome said too. They have to bring in authoritarian types of government. Planned long ago, mind you. Long ago. H.G. Wells talked about it in his various writings about, for instance, a modern utopia. And he talked about this, not just a guardian class, but they'd also have these Kissinger types or Attali types. I've mentioned him many, many times and read from his books as well on this show, who he called the samurai. Very aesthetic types and trained in a special way, special privileges and so on. But they would have ultimate authority. We see the same thing coming out of the professor that I mentioned last week or so, who's got a book out saying they'd have to bring in a warrior class to run the world, basically, to save the planet and all that kind of stuff. A lot of a hype too, just to sell his book, of course. And so he has to give a radical kind of outburst to get you to go and buy the thing, which I wouldn't bother. But non-governmental organizations also were supposed to come in, and they have come in a big, big way ever since the United Nations Treaty was signed, because along with the treaty came incredible amounts of money. And they've got all these different, for every department you have in a federal government, the United Nations has an equivalent department. So they've been giving us laws for building permits, building plans, all plumbing, electricity, everything comes from the United Nations. They're already running you. And they have been for a long time. And they were never elected by the people, any people of the world, into getting an official position over us. They're a private corporation. It was prime ministers and presidents, all socialists, who gave credence to the United Nations, and it was the big multi-trillionaires of that day who set it up in the first place to serve them and bring in the right kind of society.